You are probably wondering about my sermon title. Yada, yada, yada. And it's a riff on something that I'm going to take this off again. One of these days, we're going to fix this microphone, but I'm going to the other microphone. All right, sound people, am I on? All right, so, yada, yada, yada. One of the things that you probably do not know about me is that I have watched a lot of TV in my life. And I still watch a lot of TV. That's a true confession. But one of the things that you do when you watch TV is that you can kind of catch certain cultural phenomenons that are going on. And the reference to yada, yada, yada was actually a reference to a episode from Seinfeld. Remember that show? Yeah, and I actually have a slide here. There we go. And it was an episode in which they would be talking to somebody, and they would just kind of decide that it really wasn't, their conversation really wasn't much, and so they would just kind of say at the end of their conversation, instead of saying the full sentence, they do yada, yada, yada. It would be like me saying, well, it's a nice day today, congregation. Yada, yada, yada. In other words, yada, yada, yada was kind of a filler for the conversation, and it was just nonsense. And it was a way that in the Seinfeld episode, it was a way of just kind of being nonchalant in the conversation and not taking who they were talking to very seriously. Well, it's kind of what happens sometimes in conversations. We listen when we're conversing with somebody and we want to be there, but yet we really don't want to engage. What we feel like is that perhaps we're saying to that other person, yada, 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 or we're hearing back, yada, yada, yada. How many of you saw the royal wedding yesterday? How many of you saw the Right Reverend, I can't remember his last name, the preacher? Curry. Yes, the American Episcopal Bishop preach. Yeah, you saw that, didn't you? Did you happen to see the faces of the royals as he was preaching? Poor Queen, you could just see it in her wheels turning. She didn't. First of all, it didn't seem like she knew what hit her. But secondly, as you watch some of the faces of the royals, it was like they were thinking, yada, yada, yada. And then there were other people in the crowd like Oprah, and they showed Oprah once, and she was like, yeah, this is my word. Preach it, Pastor. And then of course George Clooney and his beautiful wife were sitting there, and they were kind of leaning in and trying to listen to what he was talking about love. And so the Right Reverend was getting a mixed message, but in most cases it should not have been yada, 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 but hear what the Spirit is talking and hear what the Spirit is speaking to you in this moment of love between these two young people as they unite their hearts together. Yada, yada, yada. That's kind of what some people were thinking about on the day of Pentecost. We know the story. We know that the disciples had gathered together, and it was a short time after Jesus had died, and Jesus had appeared again, and Jesus had ascended into heaven. And if you remember last week when I was talking to you about the ascension, I said that in a lot of ways, the ascension was the disciples' graduation day. It was a day in which they were, if they were a bunch of people getting swim lessons, it was the day that they finally had to take off their little water wings and swim out into the big pond, to use a really weird metaphor. But now we have the disciples up in this upper room in Jerusalem. And there were other people gathered there, and the disciples all of a sudden felt the Spirit come upon them. And in the book of Acts, what it says is the Spirit appeared to them like tongues of fire, hovering above their head. That vision of red that I see in our congregation today. Those tongues of fire were hovering over the disciples. And they were wondering what was happening. And then, the most curious thing happened. They started to speak in other languages. How many of you have are fluent in another language? Okay, there was one in the back there. Reverend Charlton was going, so. I know that some of you are fluent in other languages. Well, it was kind of like they were speaking another language. They were not understanding what they were speaking, but those gathered around them, those bystanders, were hearing their own language. And Judith, as she read that list of languages, and Judith, you did a pretty good job pronouncing all of those. But they were hearing their own language being spoken. And not only that, but through their language being spoken, they were hearing the Spirit of God speaking to them. But not only that, they were not only hearing, but they were feeling the power of the Spirit of God in their lives. Now, we also read that there were some that were questioning this phenomenon. There were some that were literally saying, yada, yada, yada. They could not understand what was going on. You know, in our life together, we do a lot of that. We do a lot of that yada, yada, yada with one another. We do a lot of speaking over one another or not listening to one another. I think a perfect example of that is what we have for, and I'm putting it in quotes, news today. You see a couple of, or some different logos of news agencies. You see MSNBC, you see Fox News, you see CNN, and you see ABC and CBS, and those last two that I named used to be reputable news organizations. But what it seems like is that as you watch the news today, there are several things happening. Number one is, and I don't mean to be crass when I say this, but if it bleeds, it leads. In other words, the news is always sensationalized. The second thing that I notice about the news, especially Fox News and MSNBC and CNN, is that there will be something that will lead in terms of the news, and then they have a panel of people supposedly talking about that. And what it is that towards the end of their conversation or their discussion, what you see is that they're just talking over one another. They're like, each one of them are saying to the opposite, yada, yada, yada. I'm not listening to you and you're not listening to me. And it comes out that way for us that are listeners. And so I think that as I look at the day of Pentecost, what I see is, I see a couple of things. One is that I see that when the disciples started to speak in those other languages, I see people kind of leaning in and listening more closely to what those disciples were saying to the crowd in their own languages. It's as if the Spirit had broken down those barriers and people were finally listening to one another and getting one another. That's kind of a lesson for today. The lesson for today in that particular instance is that we need to practice leaning in and listening to one another. I think as we have had another tragedy, another school shooting, what people do is that they react, and they react sometimes in the most despicable ways. You always have those politicians that will come forward and say, well, if the teachers were armed, this wouldn't happen. And there was a politician that came forward and said, well, in this school there were too many entrances. All they needed was one entrance, and that way they could get out. That was just ludicrous. And in each of those cases, the people that make those statements don't listen to the victims and first of all, listen to their sorrow and listen to what they're going through. But I hope that as we get further from this, and I think that the students at Parkland have kind of taught us, is that we need to listen to one another better. And by that, by listening to one another better, what it does is that we kind of sow that common ground so that we can move forward in this instance and perhaps live a different way. Perhaps have safe schools. Perhaps come up with solutions that will provide for safe schools, for a safer society, instead of talking over one another and instead of trying to stake our position and saying this is the only position and this is the only way. We need to be in dialogue with one another. But the second thing that I hear in this passage, and the one that is the most important to me besides open dialogue, is the fact that the Spirit spoke in that place. The Spirit spoke loud and clear in that place, and what it said in that instance is that no longer is there any separation in Christ. No longer is there division in Christ. No longer is there division. Instead, by the Spirit speaking in the different languages of those there, it gave people a sense of unity. And you know what? The funny thing about that day of Pentecost was that it didn't stop there. That it didn't stop with that strange, sort of mysterious, weird thing happening with those disciples speaking different languages and people hearing their language. It literally spread like wildfire. And what was amazing was that there was a disciple that clearly understood it. Peter. Peter, also known as the Rock, but also that disciple that kind of had some trials and tribulations with his Lord when Jesus was around. But Peter heard the Spirit speaking, and he stood with the 11, and he raised his voice, and he said, "Men of Judea and women of Judea, let this be known to you, and listen to what I say." He proclaimed that the people that were speaking in these strange tongues were not drunk, but they were prophesying what the prophet Joel said, "In the last days God will declare that I will pour my Spirit out on all flesh. Your sons and daughters will prophesy. Your young men shall see visions, and your old men shall dream dreams. I will show you portents in the heaven above and signs in the earth below. The sun and the moon will be turned differently before the coming of the Lord. But the Lord is here, and the Lord is great and glorious. Young men shall will see visions, and the old men and women shall dream dreams. Your sons and daughters shall prophesy." That was the promise on that day. But it's a promise that lives on in each and every one of us. No longer do we have to say yada, yada, yada to one another. No longer do we have to speak above one another. For if we are truly united in Christ, our hearts are united, and our ears are open, and our eyes have been opened to see the Spirit that abounds within this place and the world. And what it is asking us to do is to go out and to be those that dream the dreams of a better place, to be those that will live that Spirit out in the world, to be those that will exemplify Christ's love in the world. The Right Episcopal Bishop talked about love in a sermon yesterday. And he quoted Martin Luther King, who I quote a lot, and I won't quote today other than to say that Martin Luther King had that vision for a just society centered around that Spirit of Christ. That's my vision. That's my hope. And that's the vision and hope that with every ounce of my spirit, I try to live in the world in which we live. I hope you do also. Amen.